I want you to imagine something. You're walking home. It's early evening. You know this route. You've walked it dozens of times before. You're thinking about getting home. Maybe what's for dinner. Maybe the TV show everyone's watching tonight. And then someone approaches you, says something, grabs your arm, and in 60 seconds, your entire life is over. That's what happened to Carlie Brucia on February 1st, 2004. But here's what makes this case different from so many others. Those 60 seconds were captured on camera, every moment of it. The approach, the conversation, the grab, the walk out of frame. And when that footage was broadcast across America, it didn't just help solve a crime. It exposed something far bigger. It showed the nation exactly what happens when a broken system lets a violent repeat offender walk free, over and over and over again, until he finally does something unforgivable. Let me take you back to that day, not to the moment of the abduction. Not yet. Let's start with who Carlie was, because that matters more than anything else. If you asked Carlie Brucia's teachers to describe her in one word, they'd probably say light. That's what her principal called her, a shining light. But if you asked her friends, they'd tell you she was the girl who gave the best hugs, the one who could make you laugh when you were having a terrible day, the one who sang off-key on purpose just to make her mom smile. Carlie was 11 years old in February 2004. She was in 6th grade at McIntosh Middle School in Sarasota, Florida. She sang in the choir. She loved Jennifer Lopez. She was obsessed with shoes. She had this cat that she absolutely adored. She was born on March 16th, 1992, in Long Island, New York. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she moved to Florida with her mom, Susan. But she never let go of those New York roots. Every Christmas, every summer, she'd fly back to Long Island to spend time with her dad, Joe. Those Christmas visits were her favorite. The snow, the family, the feeling of being home. In Sarasota, she lived with her mom, Susan, and her stepfather, Stephen. She had a younger half-brother. By all accounts, it was a good home, a normal childhood, school, choir practice, hanging out with friends, mall trips on weekends. Carlie was the kind of kid who made adults stop and think, man, if my kid turns out like that, I'll have done something right. Her teachers loved her. Her classmates loved her. Even people who barely knew her felt that warmth. And here's the thing about Carlie that I think is important to understand. She was trusting. She was kind. She believed in the goodness of people. Those are beautiful qualities in a child. Those are qualities we should celebrate and protect. But on February 1st, 2004, those qualities made her vulnerable. Before we get to what happened to Carlie, you need to understand who Joseph Peter Smith was. Because this story isn't just about one terrible crime. It's about how that crime was completely preventable. Joseph Smith was born on March 17, 1966, in Brooklyn, New York. By the time he crossed paths with Carlie, he was 37 years old. He had 3 daughters of his own. He'd worked as an auto mechanic, and he had a criminal record that should have kept him locked up for years. Let me walk you through this, because it's important. In 1993, Smith attacked a woman on a Sarasota street. He broke her nose with a motorcycle helmet. That's aggravated battery. That's violent assault with a weapon. He pleaded no contest, served 60 days in jail, and got 2 years probation. 60 days for smashing a woman's face with a helmet. After that, Smith was on probation almost continuously for over a decade. Think about that. From 1993 to 2004, 11 years. He was under the supervision of the state of Florida. They were supposed to be monitoring him, making sure he stayed clean. But here's what actually happened. 1997. Concealed weapons charge. Carrying a 5-inch knife in his waistband. Probation. 1999. Heroin possession. 18 months probation. 1 month later, prescription fraud. Charge dropped. 2000. Prescription fraud again. 6 months house arrest. Then a year of probation. And then there was the case that should have sent up every red flag imaginable. In 1998, Smith was charged with false imprisonment and kidnapping. He'd been accused of trying to force a woman into his vehicle, but he was acquitted. He told the jury he meant her no harm, and they believed him. Throughout all of this, Smith had a severe drug problem: heroin, Cocaine. Prescription painkillers for chronic back pain from a car accident. His probation officers knew about it. They documented it. They watched him cycle through addiction and relapse. Over and over. In August 2003, 5 months before Carlie's murder, Smith tested positive for cocaine. He was depressed. Suicidal. His probation officer noted it in his file. And then, in January 2004, 1 month before Carlie died, Smith was found passed out in a parking lot with a bag of cocaine in his lap. A probation officer requested that a judge violate Smith's probation and send him back to jail. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a formal request. Smith had violated the terms of his release. Under the law, he should have gone back to prison for 5 years. The judge did not act on that request. Joseph Smith remained free. He was on drug offender probation, not in jail, not being closely monitored, free to drive around Sarasota in a yellow Buick station wagon that belonged to friends who'd taken him in after his wife kicked him out. Free to sit in that car on Bee Ridge Road on Super Bowl Sunday, high on cocaine, with absolutely nothing to lose. And that's how, on February 1st, 2004, a man with 13 arrests and a decade-long pattern of violence and drug abuse was in the exact wrong place at the exact wrong time. Because Carlie Brucia was about to walk past him, let me tell you about February 1st, 2004. From Carlie's perspective, it's Sunday afternoon. You're 11 years old. You've been at your friend's house all day, just hanging out, being a kid. The Super Bowl is tonight. Patriots versus Panthers. You want to get home to watch it with your family. Around 6:10 in the evening, you tell your friend you're heading out. It's not dark yet. It's early February in Florida, so there's still some light. You know the route home, less than 1 mile. You've walked it before. Your friend's mom calls your mom to make sure it's okay that you're walking alone. Your mom says no, absolutely not, and sends your stepfather to come pick you up, but you've already left. You're walking down Bee Ridge Road. There's a car wash up ahead, Evie's Car Wash. Next to it is a miniature golf course and an ice cream place. There are people around, not a crowd, but people, less than 300 feet away. Families are doing normal Sunday things. You walk past the car wash, and there's a man there. He's wearing a mechanic's uniform. He approaches you, he says something. You stop. You talk to him for a few seconds, and then he grabs your arm. The surveillance camera at the car wash captures all of it. The timestamp reads 6:21 p.m. You can see Carlie in her pink shirt with her pink backpack. You can see the man in the dark uniform. You can see him grab her. You can see him lead her out of frame. 60 seconds. That's all it took. By 6:45 p.m., Carlie's parents knew something was wrong. She should have been home. They called 911 immediately.
911, what's the location of the emergency?
My daughter is missing. She's gone. We can't find her anywhere. I've called all her friends.
How old is she?
11.
And when was the last time that she was seen?
It was at 6 o'clock, around 6 o'clock.
The search began. When Sarasota law enforcement got the call about a missing 11-year-old girl, they mobilized fast. Officers flooded the neighborhood. They searched every route Carlie could have taken. They knocked on doors. They called in every resource they had. And on the morning of February 2nd, they brought in a bloodhound named Ruby. Bloodhounds are incredible animals. They can track a scent over incredible distances, through all kinds of terrain, even days after someone has passed through an area. Ruby was one of the best. They gave Ruby something with Carlie's scent on it, and Ruby went to work. The dog picked up the trail immediately. She followed Carlie's exact route from the friend's house, down the sidewalk, along Bee Ridge Road. The officers followed behind, watching Ruby work, and then Ruby stopped, right at the back of Evie's car wash. The scent just ended, not faded. Ended. The officers knew what that meant. Carlie had been put into a vehicle at that exact spot. Now, here's where this case takes the turn that would eventually crack it wide open. The owner of the car wash was standing outside watching all of this. Police officers, search dogs, the whole scene. He walked over and mentioned to one of the officers that he had security cameras installed around the property. Motion-activated cameras. Would they like to review the footage? Absolutely. They would. The owner pulled up the recordings, and there it was. Camera at the rear of the car wash. Timestamp 6:21 p.m. on February 1st. A young girl walking past. A man in a mechanic's uniform approaching her, grabbing her arm, leading her away. You could see a yellow station wagon in the parking lot. You could see the man's walk, his build, his movements. The footage was grainy, black and white, but it showed everything. By that evening, February 2nd, the decision was made. Release the video to the media. Get it on every news channel. Someone out there had to recognize this man. The Amber Alert went out. The surveillance footage played on repeat on CNN. Fox News. Every local station from Florida to California. A little girl in a pink shirt. A man in a mechanic's uniform. If you know who this is, call immediately. And the tips started coming in. On the morning of February 3rd, a woman in Sarasota was watching the news coverage. She saw the surveillance video, and something about the man in that footage struck her as familiar. She called her husband over. "Come look at this," she said. "Doesn't that look like Joe Smith?" Her husband had worked with Joseph Smith at an auto repair shop. He knew Joe. He'd worked alongside him, watched him move around the shop, seen his mannerisms every single day. He watched the video, and he didn't just think it looked like Joseph Smith. He knew it was Joseph Smith. Years later, he'd testify about this moment. He'd say, "I worked with him at the shop, so I knew what he looked like. The sneakers, the back of his head, the way his hair was cut, the way that he walked. His gait was just like Joe walking through the shop. He's got a different type of walk to him. And then when I watched him reach for the girl, the way he reached for her, I've seen him pick up tools like that. I knew it was him." The husband called the police immediately. He spoke with Detective Vincent Riva. He gave them Joseph Smith's current address. He told them about the yellow Buick that Smith had been driving lately, borrowed from friends. Now here's the thing. At the exact same time this tip was coming in, Joseph Smith was being arrested, not for kidnapping Carlie, for drug possession and probation violation. On February 3rd, law enforcement had gone to the house where Smith was staying to execute a search warrant on an unrelated matter. When they searched the yellow Buick Century station wagon Smith had been using, they found drug paraphernalia, a spoon that looked like it had been used to melt narcotics, a syringe in a cardboard box in the trunk. Smith was arrested on the spot for violating his probation. So when Detective Riva got the call from the businessman saying, "The man in the video is Joseph Smith," and then checked the system to see if Smith was in custody, he found that Smith had just been arrested hours earlier. The pieces were falling into place. But there was one massive problem. They still didn't know where Carlie was, and Joseph Smith wasn't talking. When detectives tried to question him, Smith immediately asked for an attorney, which was his legal right. But it meant the clock was ticking. Every hour that passed was an hour Carlie could be out there. Somewhere. Scared. Hurt. Or worse. The investigators worked around the clock. They searched Smith's room at the house where he'd been staying. They found mechanics' uniforms in the closet that matched what the man in the video had been wearing. They processed the yellow Buick for evidence. But they needed more. They needed a confession. They needed to know where Carlie was. And on February 5th, 2004, they got their answer from the last person they expected, Joseph Smith's brother. John Smith had a complicated relationship with his brother Joseph. They'd grown up together. They'd struggled together. They both had their demons. But on the evening of February 5th, 2004, John Smith made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and also help bring justice for an 11-year-old girl he'd never met. John called an FBI agent who'd been working the case. The first words out of John's mouth were, "I guess you heard. What do you want to do?" The FBI agent was confused. John's cell phone had never been tapped. Law enforcement hadn't been monitoring his calls, but John apparently believed they had. And that one sentence told the FBI agent everything he needed to know. Joseph had told John something. Joseph had confessed to his brother. 2 FBI agents and a local officer immediately drove to John's house. When they arrived, John was waiting for them. He told them to follow him. He got in his car and drove them to Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road in Sarasota. They pulled into the church parking lot. John got out of his car and pointed to the field behind the church building. You need to search out there, he said. Look near the concrete blocks. About 50 yards out. While they were standing there, John's phone rang. It was Joseph calling from jail. John took the call. The officers couldn't hear what Joseph was saying, but they could see John's face. They could see the weight of whatever knowledge he was carrying. After the call ended, John confirmed what the investigators had been dreading for 4 days. Carlie's body was out in that field. The officers called for backup. A full search team arrived. They spread out across the wooded area behind the church, searching near the concrete blocks John had described, and they found her. Carlie Jane Brucia was lying in the woods, approximately 50 yards from a group of concrete blocks, exactly where John said she would be. She was naked from the waist down, except for one sock still on her foot. The medical examiner would later determine that Carlie had been sexually assaulted. She had died from ligature strangulation. Someone had used a narrow object, like a shoelace, wrapped around her neck and crisscrossed at the back, and choked the life out of her. 4 days. Carlie had been missing for 4 days. Her family had been holding out hope. The community had been praying. Volunteers had been searching. And now they had their answer. Carlie was gone. Once Carlie's body was discovered, the investigation entered a new phase. They had a suspect in custody. They had a body. Now they needed to build a case that would hold up in court. The forensic evidence was devastating. First, the surveillance footage. Multiple witnesses, including Smith's former coworker, had identified him as the man in the video. The yellow Buick visible in the footage matched the car Smith had been driving. Second, the vehicle itself. When forensic analysts processed that 1992 Buick Century station wagon, they found hair samples. 2 head hairs recovered from the car were consistent with Carlie's hair. They also found fibers. 7 fiber samples from the car matched the pink shirt Carlie had been wearing when she disappeared. But the most damning evidence was the DNA. A semen sample was found on Carlie's pink shirt. When they ran DNA testing comparing that sample to Joseph Smith's DNA profile, they got a match. And I want you to understand just how definitive this match was. The forensic supervisor who testified at trial explained that the probability of randomly selecting a DNA profile from a Caucasian male that would match the sample found on Carlie's shirt was 1 in 32 quintillion. That's a 32 with 18 zeros after it. 1 in 32 quintillion. To put that in perspective, there are only about 8 billion people on Earth. The chances of this DNA belonging to anyone other than Joseph Smith were so infinitesimally small that they're effectively impossible. There was also Carlie's pink backpack, the one she'd been wearing when she left her friend's house. It was found among Smith's possessions. And then there was John Smith's testimony. Joseph's brother would later testify in court about the conversations they'd had, about how Joseph had confessed to him, about how Joseph had told him where to find the body. When you laid it all out, the surveillance video, the car, the DNA, the hair, the fibers, the backpack, the brother's testimony, it created an absolutely undeniable picture of what happened. Joseph Smith had been sitting in that Buick on Bee Ridge Road on February 1st, 2004. He was high on cocaine. He was homeless, having been kicked out by his wife. He was unemployed. Having been fired from his mechanic job, his life was falling apart. And when he saw Carlie Brucia walking alone, he made a choice. He got out of the car. He approached her. He grabbed her. He forced her into the vehicle. He drove her to that field behind the church. He sexually assaulted her. And then he strangled her to death and left her body in the woods. On February 20th, 2004, Joseph Peter Smith was indicted on 3 counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery on a child under 12 years of age. The trial was set for November 2005, and the nation asked the question that's still being asked today. How is this man free to do this? Here's what keeps me up at night about this case. Joseph Smith had been arrested 13 times between 1993 and 2004. 13 times. Assault, drugs, weapons, prescription fraud, kidnapping charges that he was acquitted on. The longest he ever spent in jail for any of these offenses was less than 14 months. Think about that. Over a decade of criminal activity, over a decade of the system having the opportunity to say, no, You've had enough chances. You're done. And every single time, he got probation. He got house arrest. He got drug offender programs. And every single time, he violated those conditions. And every single time, he was given another chance. In January 2004, 1 month before Carlie died, Joseph Smith was found unconscious in a parking lot with a bag of cocaine in his lap. This was a clear, unambiguous probation violation. His probation officer filed paperwork requesting that a judge revoke his probation and send him back to prison for 5 years. That was the law. That was supposed to be automatic. You violate drug offender probation with cocaine possession. You go back to jail. The judge did not act on that request. Carlie's father, Joe Brucia, has been saying this for 20 years now. He says it every time someone asks him about the case. Joseph Smith was supposed to go back to jail for 5 years if he violated. He did violate. He was passed out with a bag of cocaine in a parking lot. Instead of them giving the consequence that they said they would, they gave him drug offender probation. That's why my daughter is not here today. And he's right. That's not hyperbole. That's not a grieving father looking for someone to blame. That's the factual truth. If that judge had acted on the probation officer's request in January 2004, Joseph Smith would have been in jail on February 1st, 2004. He wouldn't have been sitting in that Buick on Bee Ridge Road. He wouldn't have crossed paths with Carlie Brucia. Carlie would have walked home from her friend's house. She would have watched the Super Bowl with her family. She would have gone to school the next day. She would have turned 12, 13, 14. She would still be alive. That's what systemic failure looks like. It's not dramatic. It's not a massive conspiracy. It's a judge who didn't process paperwork fast enough. It's a probation officer with too many cases to manage. It's a system that gives violent offenders chance after chance after chance because jails are overcrowded and budgets are tight, and nobody wants to be the one who sends someone to prison for a drug violation until that person kills a child. And then everyone asks, how did this happen? How did we not see this coming? But people did see it coming. The probation officer who filed that request in January 2004 saw it coming. She knew Joseph Smith was dangerous. She knew he needed to be locked up. The system just didn't listen. The trial of Joseph Peter Smith began on November 7th, 2005, almost 2 years after Carlie's death. The prosecution presented their case over several days. The surveillance footage, the DNA evidence, the hair and fiber analysis, the testimony from John Smith about where the body was found, the medical examiner's findings about how Carlie died. The defense tried to humanize Joseph Smith. They talked about his drug addiction, his chronic pain from the car accident, his depression. They brought in witnesses who said he had good qualities, that he loved his own daughters, that he'd struggled with demons for years. But there's no defense for what the evidence showed. There's no mitigating circumstance that erases DNA evidence. There's no addiction so severe that it excuses strangling an 11-year-old child. Joseph Smith chose not to testify. He waived his closing statement during the guilt phase. On November 17, 2005, after about 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, capital sexual battery on a child under 12. The penalty phase began immediately. This is where the jury would decide whether Joseph Smith should get the death penalty or life in prison. Carlie's family testified. Her mother, Susan, took the stand, crying, struggling to breathe, and said, "I lost the love of my life. I cry for her at all hours of the day. I cry for her at night. I'm broken. I will never heal." Outside the courthouse, she was more direct. "I want him dead," she said. Her father, Joe, talked about the shoe shopping trips, the amusement park visits, the Christmas holidays. When Carlie was taken from our family, it hurt us to the core. Many times I didn't want to go on and was close to taking my own life. On December 1st, 2005, the jury voted on the death penalty recommendation. The vote was 10-2 in favor of death. In Florida at that time, the jury's vote didn't have to be unanimous. It was just a recommendation to the judge. The judge made the final decision. On March 15th, 2006, Judge Andrew Owens sentenced Joseph Smith to death by lethal injection for the murder. plus 2 consecutive life sentences for the kidnapping and sexual battery. Justice was served, the case was closed. Except it wasn't. Because what followed was 17 years of legal appeals, constitutional challenges, and courtroom battles that would extend all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2018, the Florida Supreme Court vacated Smith's death sentence. The reason, in a case called Hurst versus Florida, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that juries in death penalty cases must be unanimous. Smith's jury had voted 10-2. That wasn't good enough anymore. The death sentence was thrown out. But then in April 2020, the Florida Supreme Court reinstated the death sentence under new legal precedent. Smith was back on death row. Then, more appeals, more legal challenges. By 2021, Smith was scheduled for another resentencing hearing. Joe Brucia, Carlie's father, talked about this legal nightmare in an interview. They dragged this thing on from 2005 to 2021, and it's still not even done yet. I have a lot of venom and disdain for the criminal justice system. And then, on July 26, 2021, Joseph Peter Smith died in his prison cell at Union Correctional Institution in Ryford, Florida. He was 55 years old. The cause of death was liver cancer. He died before he could be executed. He died while his case was still being appealed. He died without ever being put to death by the state of Florida. Carlie's father, Joe, said he was elated when he heard the news. I feel wonderful. It's long overdue. The inept and corrupt criminal justice system could not get it done. So the natural order of things finally took care of it. 17 years. From conviction to death. 17 years of legal battles. 17 years that Carlie's family had to relive the worst day of their lives over and over every time there was a new hearing, a new appeal, a new legal motion. That's what justice looked like in this case. Not closure, not resolution, just exhaustion. In the wake of Carlie's murder, there was public outrage. People wanted to know how Joseph Smith had been free. They wanted answers. They wanted change. U.S. Representative Katherine Harris from Florida introduced federal legislation that became known as Carlie's Law. The proposal was simple: automatic revocation of probation for anyone who committed a felony, a violent crime, or sexual contact with a minor while on probation or supervised release. Under existing law at the time, judges had discretion. They could choose to revoke probation or not. And as Joseph Smith's case showed, sometimes they chose not to act. Carlie's Law would have removed that discretion. If you're on probation and you commit another crime, you go to jail. Period. No exceptions. No second chances. Representative Harris argued that this would prevent exactly what happened to Carlie. If this law had been in effect in January 2004, Joseph Smith would have been automatically sent back to jail when he was found with cocaine. No judge needed to process paperwork. No delays. Automatic. The bill also included provisions for notifying non-custodial parents when there was criminal activity near their children. It was designed to close every gap that had allowed Joseph Smith to slip through. Public support was strong. Carlie's case was all over the news. The surveillance footage had been seen by millions of people. Everyone was asking the same question: how do we make sure this never happens again? But then the reality of lawmaking set in. The costs, the logistics, the overcrowding in prisons, the pushback from criminal justice advocates who worried about mandatory minimums and lack of judicial discretion. A watered-down version of the bill eventually passed. But it only applied to sex offenders. And here's the problem. Joseph Smith had never been convicted of a sex offense before Carlie's murder. His record was drugs, assault, fraud, not sex crimes. So even if the full version of Carlie's Law had passed, it might not have applied to Joseph Smith anyway. At the state level, Florida lawmakers introduced similar legislation, a bill that would force judges to deny bail to violent probation violators. That bill failed to pass in the legislative session. The reform effort stalled. The momentum faded. And Carlie's Law never became the sweeping change that people hoped it would be. Carlie's father, Joe, has talked about this for years. How many times does the system have to fail before the failure becomes unacceptable? We still don't have a good answer to that question. I need to tell you about Susan Shorpen, Susan was Carlie's mother. She was the one who raised Carlie in Sarasota. She was the one who sent Carlie's stepfather to pick her up from the friend's house on February 1st. She was the one who knew, within 30 minutes, that something was terribly wrong. Susan testified at Joseph Smith's trial. She stood in front of the jury, fighting back tears, struggling to breathe, and said, "I lost the love of my life. I cry for her at all hours of the day. I cry for her at night. I'm broken. I will never heal." And she was right. She didn't heal. After Carlie's death, Susan tried to channel her grief into something productive. She became a volunteer with Predator Patrol, an organization working to protect children from online predators. She attended Narcotics Anonymous meetings. She tried to rebuild her life. But the losses kept coming. Her brother died in a car accident. Her father, who had Alzheimer's disease, passed away. And then her 11-year-old son, Carlie's half-brother, was seriously injured when he was hit by a drunk driver. Loss after loss after loss, each one compounding the trauma of losing Carlie. Friends who knew Susan during this time said she was trying. She was showing up to NA meetings. She was reaching out for help. She had a good soul, a kind heart. She wanted to get better, but the weight was too much. On April 10th, 2017, Susan Shorpen was found dead in Polk County, Florida. She was 47 years old. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was a heroin overdose. Susan died without ever seeing Joseph Smith executed. She died 13 years after losing her daughter. She died carrying a grief that never stopped growing. Her friend Judy Cornett, a child advocate who had worked with Susan, said it best. Carlie's death was something impossible for Susan to recover from. This was clearly one of the biggest blows imaginable in her life. Another friend from Narcotics Anonymous, Cassie Baldwin, said Susan was always kind and sweet in meetings. The fact she was there showed me she was trying to work through her demons. She was just a sweet lady. When you talk about the victims of Carlie's murder, you can't just count Carlie. You have to count Susan too, because the crime that took Carlie's life on February 1st, 2004, eventually took Susan's life on April 10th, 2017. That's the real cost of violence. It doesn't stop with the immediate victim. It ripples out. It destroys families. It breaks people who were never meant to carry that kind of pain. Susan Shorpen is buried now. She's at peace. And people who loved her say that at least she's with Carlie again. That's the only comfort there is. There's one more part of this story that needs to be told. 4 years before Carlie Brucia was murdered, on March 28, 2000, a 25-year-old woman named Tara Leigh Riley was found dead in a pond behind a Walmart in Bradenton, Florida. Tara had been lured to that Walmart parking lot by a phone call. Someone had told her they had information that would help her with an ongoing custody battle. When she arrived, she was murdered. Her naked body was left in the pond. The case went cold. Investigators followed leads that went nowhere. They had suspects, but never enough evidence to make an arrest. And then, years later, after Joseph Smith was convicted of murdering Carlie, his brother John made a stunning statement. John Smith said he would bet his life that Joseph was also responsible for Tara Riley's murder. John had been seeing Tara. They were co-workers. He knew her personally, and he believed his brother had killed her. The Bradenton Police Department confirmed that Joseph Smith was a suspect in Tara's unsolved case, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. And now that Joseph Smith is dead, the likelihood of that case ever being solved is almost zero. Tara Riley's mother, Kathleen, spent 20 years waiting for answers. She died in August 2023, never knowing who killed her daughter. If John Smith is right, if Joseph did kill Tara Riley, then the system failed twice. A 25-year-old woman lost her life in 2000. An 11-year-old girl lost her life in 2004. And both times, the killer was a man who should have been behind bars. These are the cases that haunt law enforcement. The cold ones, the unsolved ones, the ones where they know who probably did it, but can't prove it. Tara Riley deserves to be remembered too. Her case deserves to be solved. Her family deserves closure. But with Joseph Smith dead, that might never happen. It's been over 20 years since February 1st, 2004, 20 years since Carlie Brucia walked past Evie's car wash on her way home. 20 years since that surveillance camera captured 60 seconds that would change everything. 20 years since a bloodhound named Ruby tracked a little girl's scent and stopped at the spot where her trail ended. Carlie would be 32 years old today if she'd lived. She'd be older than I am. She might have graduated college. She might have a career. She might be married. Might have kids of her own. She might still be singing off-key to make people laugh, but we don't get to know any of that. Because on February 1st, 2004, a man who'd been arrested 13 times and never spent more than 14 months in jail decided to take all of those possibilities away from her. So, what's left? What's Carlie's legacy? It's the surveillance footage that's still used in criminal justice classes to talk about the importance of security cameras. It's the Amber Alert protocols that were strengthened because of her case. It's the conversations about probation reform that still happen every time a violent offender reoffends. It's the memorial at the spot where she was taken. The ribbons that were tied around trees all over Sarasota. The candlelight vigils. The community that came together and said, "We will not forget this child." It's her father, Joe, who still speaks out about the failures of the system, who still demands accountability, who refuses to let people forget that his daughter died because the system didn't do its job. It's the fact that we're still talking about her case 20 years later, still asking the hard questions, still demanding that we do better. Carlie's law might not have passed in its full form. The reforms might not have been as sweeping as people hoped, but the conversation didn't stop. Parents became more aware. Communities became more vigilant. The name Carlie Brucia became synonymous with the need for criminal justice reform. And most importantly, Carlie herself is remembered, not as a case number, not as a statistic, but as a real kid, a girl who hugged everyone she met, who sang in the choir, who loved her cat, who made her mom laugh, who deserved every single day she never got to live. Her stepfather, Stephen, said something after the trial that's always stuck with me. He said the verdict didn't make the pain go away. It didn't bring Carlie back, but it made him feel like Carlie had been heard. That's what we can do for her now. We can make sure she continues to be heard. We can tell her story. We can honor her memory. We can fight for the changes that might prevent another family from going through what the Brucias went through. We can remember that behind every true crime story is a real person, a real family, real grief that never fully heals. Carlie Jane Brucia, born March 16th, 1992, died February 1st, 2004, 11 years old, loved by everyone who knew her. Taken far too soon, she deserved better, and we owe it to her to do better.